All right, hi everyone. In this short lecture video, we're going to talk about the growth of bone and the remodeling of bone. So big picture, as we talk about bone growth, we look at sort of this cartoon image of a person, right, as they're born and they grow and develop, and then we have an aging process. So what we want to think about is our bones have to have a way, obviously, that we grow in length, but we also have to have our bones be able to grow in diameter. And then when we go through different types of mechanical stress or even go through and have a fracture, we have to have a way to remodel and repair our bone. And then also we'll talk a little bit about what happens or what can happen, what we want to try to prevent as we age. So before we get into bone growth, let's just remind ourselves the type of bone cells that are found in bone tissue. So we have the stem cells, right, we call those osteoprogenitor cells. You may also see them referred to as osteogenic. And these cells then are going to remain as stem cells, but they can divide to produce our bone builders, right, or our osteoblasts. So blasts are builders. So osteoblasts means they are builders of bone tissue. They secrete specifically this organic matrix called osteoid that contains proteins, specifically collagen, and that's going to be sort of the foundation for where the minerals can deposit in that matrix. Now we also have the osteocytes. So the osteoblasts are basically building up this matrix, right, the extracellular matrix, and eventually they will become surrounded by that matrix. And at that point, they are considered mature osteocytes. So these are mature osteoblasts, right? And what the purpose of these osteocytes is to maintain the matrix and to detect what kind of stress, specifically mechanical stress, that's put on the bone. Our final type are the osteoclasts. So these are doing the opposite of the blasts, right? The blasts are building up bone tissue. These are breaking down bone tissue, and they do that by what's called resorption. So they are breaking down that extracellular matrix, and they do that by they secrete some acidic components that begins to break down some of that mineral, but they also release enzymes that will degrade away at some of the proteins. So to break down the cellular matrix or the extracellular matrix. Now remember that we have both compact bone, sometimes called cortical bone, and spongy bone, right? Both of these are living tissues. They have vascular supply, they have nerves that carry signals. The compact bone is denser, right? And what we find is the living cells are found in these concentric circles called osteons. We find the compact bone on the outer part of the bone and in the shaft or the diaphysis. The spongy bone is this lattice network, and it forms what's called trabeculae. And the spongy bone is found more internal, right, near the medullary cavity, but also in the ends, okay, the epiphyses. Now, the first type of growth we're going to talk about is interstitial growth. So this is basically making the bones longer, okay? So we think about when a infant is first born, obviously there's a lot of length that has to happen, lengthening to those bones as they grow. And we talked in a previous video that where the cartilage remains is called the epiphyseal plate. And that is the portion that we're talking about where we would continue to have growth occurring to lengthen those bones. So we're going to go through step by step this image on the right and go through the phases. But I want to point out to you that where this is occurring, right, is in the area of the epiphyseal growth plate because there's still cartilage present in that region of long bones. All right, so this is the way that interstitial growth is going to happen. We're going to look at it based on 5 areas or 5 zones within that growth plate region Okay, so the first is called the zone of resting cartilage. So cartilage is going to point us to those chondrocytes. Okay, and this area is basically responsible for securing the epiphysis. So that's the end, right? The knobby end of the bone to the epiphyseal plate. So that's the purpose of that. So what's going on in this resting cartilage? Okay, this is just production of matrix, right? Those chondrocytes are producing the matrix to secure those together. Now the next zone is the proliferating cartilage, or the proliferative zone. When you think about this zone, what's important is that we have a lot of cell division happening. So mitosis is occurring for these chondrocytes, but it's occurring in a specific way. And notice basically they're stacking up as if you had sort of those old, when you stacked coins in a sleeve. So you have mitosis creating these columns, okay, of chondrocytes here. We move down and we have the zone of hypertrophic cartilage, or the area of maturation and hypertrophy. And essentially these cells, so look at the size of the chondrocytes in the proliferative zone when they're dividing versus the size down here. So the cells, the word hypertrophy means they're growing, right? They're getting larger. So that's exactly what's happening, okay? So we have these cells enlarging. Now, in the calcified cartilage zone, so down here, what we see is we begin to see calcification or mineral deposit that's happening in that matrix. Now, just like we've seen in our other types of bone growth, once we have calcification, those cells don't get the nutrients and the oxygen that they need, and so the chondrocytes begin to die. Now, the final zone, the zone of ossification, so ossification tells us this is where the bone production is occurring, right? Those capillaries are going to enter into that region, and with that blood supply, there are going to be these stem cells, right? The osteoprogenitor cells are going to enter that region. And when that happens, they do what the stem cells do, and they divide and become bone builders, or osteoblasts. And then we have that process continued, right, as long as there are still living chondrocytes in that epiphyseal plate. Now, once we no longer have, if we grow and build bone too fast, which we'll talk about when we talk about hormones. So when we build bone faster, then the chondrocytes can replenish. Then we end up sealing that plate and it becomes the epiphyseal line. All right, we also have, besides just bones growing in length, they need to grow in diameter or in width, right? And that's called appositional growth. So you can see that we have on the outside, right, the cortical or the compact bone, and then the spongy bone on the inside. And what we see is the periosteum is where we're going to find those stem cells, and those are going to divide to become the bone builders. So we begin to have new bone growth on the very outside within that periosteum. So, as I mentioned, it's occurring within the periosteum. Those stem cells divide to produce osteoblasts. Those are our bone builders. So they begin to lay down new bone tissue. So that word osteoid, right? They're going to lay that down, the organic part. Now, the other thing that's interesting, though, is not only do we have new bone tissue being built by the osteoblasts, we also have resorption occurring. Remember, the osteoclasts are responsible for breaking down and resorbing bone tissue. So while the osteoblasts are building, right, around the edges in the periosteum, the osteoclasts, okay, are doing the resorption in the medullary cavity on the internal part. So what we see is the diameter, right? So the size of the bone diameter is getting larger because bone is being built to the outside. But the internal cavity diameter, right, is also getting larger because the osteoclasts are resorbing some of that bone tissue from the medullary cavity. So it's important because when we compare this to bone rebuilding or remodeling, we want to make sure that we identify this is occurring in two different locations, right? Our bone building is on the outside and the resorption is on the inside in appositional growth. So now we'll talk about bone remodeling. So believe it or not, 20% of your skeleton gets, quote, remodeled each year. So you have new bone that's added, old bone that gets removed. It depends on where in your skeleton and the type of bone, but overall, it's just something that's occurring naturally. Now, spongy bone is a type of bone that's remodeled faster than our cortical or our compact bone. And we're going to have a whole lecture video that talks about how this is regulated by hormones. So put that on hold. There'll be another video about that. So part of this is driven by these hormone signals, but part of it is also driven by mechanical stress on the bones. So quick question, quick review. Do you remember which of our 4 bone cell types is responsible for detecting mechanical stress on the bone tissue? So those are our mature osteocytes, right? They're living in that bone matrix and they're detecting mechanical stress on the bone. So when it is detected, that is going to trigger our bone builders, our osteoblasts, to secrete more of that organic matrix where the mineral can be laid down. So in other words, it triggers the building of bone tissue, mechanical stress. That's why doctors are always telling us it's important to do weight-bearing exercise. Weight-bearing is essentially putting mechanical stress on our bones because our muscles are attached to those, right? And our bones are working as levers. And so that mechanical stress tells our bones, hey, you need to make more bone tissue here because you're using this area of the bone. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we think about being healthy, right? The kinds of activities that promote bone building, so your book talked about this a little bit. So walking, right? Running, lifting weights, the kinds of activities, not that they're not good for you, they may be good for you in other ways, but that aren't weight bearing are like swimming or elliptical, being on the elliptical machine. Because even though it may cause you may be using your muscles and you may be getting your heart rate up, the amount of mechanical stress on your bones is less, especially if you think about in the swimming pool, right? We feel gravity less in the swimming pool. And we know that, for example, when astronauts are in space, they have to be careful to use their muscles specifically because that just gravity itself provides a certain amount of mechanical stress on our bones. Now, the flip side of that, if someone is not active and they decide, oh, I'm just going to start training for a marathon, and they just go out and start running several miles when they have no, their body is not used to that, overly intense exercise can cause too much mechanical stress all at once, and then we might encounter a fracture or some other kind of injury. Okay, I wanted to share this image, and there is more detail here than what you need to be concerned about, but I wanted to compare and contrast here bone modeling, so building bone tissue. So for example, if we think about when we're doing appositional growth, right, growing in width, we have the bone builder. So these yellow cells, right, that we see, these are our bone builders, our osteoblasts. So one surface of the bone, that external surface, is where our bone builders are working when we're doing bone modeling, so like appositional growth. The other surface, right, in the medullary cavity, that's where those osteoclasts are resorbing or breaking down the bone. So it's 2 different surfaces, right, when we have the building of bone or bone modeling. When we have bone remodeling, okay, which is what's occurring, right, 20% of our skeleton every year, it's happening at the same surface. So we have osteoclasts that are resorbing bone, and then our osteoblasts are building or rebuilding on that same surface in the same location. So this is really the part that we should focus on. So we have our osteoclasts that are breaking that down, and then we have new bone, right, being built by our osteoblasts. So remember, this is a normal thing that is occurring as we have exercise, as we age. Let's say if you begin to work out, your muscles are going to get larger, right? They're going to hypertrophy. What happens to your bones? Well, they're going to have to enlarge also to support the muscles in that weight-bearing exercise. So we'll have another video where we talk specifically about fractures and how fractures are repaired. And again, another video about our hormone regulation of these processes. So I'll see you next time.